Today, I'm excited to share with you this discussion with my friend Molly, who grew up in Orange County, California as a child and went to high school in Texas. She was raised in the church by convert parents in the Mormon church. Molly studied illustration at BYU and served a Spanish speaking mission in Carlsbad, California. She married in the temple and is a mom of two children. She divorced after 7 years of marriage, and Molly currently is a graphic designer and loves staying active and volunteering in the community. Today, she'll share with us her very personal experience growing up as a Mormon, going to BYU, marrying after 12 weeks of meeting her ex-husband. We discussed the lack of sex education, some women's issues, her painful divorce. We also discuss mental illness, cheating spouse, rebuilding after a divorce, and a faith crisis. And she'll also share with us where she's at now. It's a heartfelt discussion that really validates many who are or have experienced similar situations, divorce, faith crisis, faith life transitions, and rebuilding. Please leave your comment below or on YouTube or on the website. We really want to hear, what you thought about this discussion and if you can relate to some of it or anything you'd like to share. Always happy to hear your voice. All right. So, yes, why don't you tell us about, growing up in the Mormon church and, maybe how you met your ex-husband and then kind of go from there. The idea is to move towards the big transition, right?
Right.
So
my background was I grew up, again, in the Mormon church. My parents were converts. They met in high school, and they came from both, I guess, Christian backgrounds. But after they were married, they were looking for a church to join that kind of had the values that they were looking for, and they liked the fact that the Mormon church was very family focused and family centered and had a lot of structure around the family. I think they also liked the fact that they had a lay clergy. They liked the fact that as part of the religion, they felt like it was kind of a restoration. My dad had always been searching for something he was having a hard time finding. So they joined the church in the late 70s. And by the time they were together for 8 years before they had children, then they ended up raising, 4 kids in the 80s in the church. I grew up in Orange County as a kid and then ended up moving to Texas, where my parents were originally from, later on. So I went to high school in Texas, in the Dallas area. And I had a very, I think, typical Mormon or, Latter-day Saint upbringing and background. We were always what we kind of would say is active and involved in the church as a child and as a youth. The fact that the church has a lot of strict rules in terms of like behavior and dress for the youth, I think was a good basis for me. There were just certain things that I grew up, not questioning in terms of like how I would act and how I would dress and the things I would be involved in and then what I wouldn't be involved in. And so it was kind of those morals and those values they instilled those in you from the very beginning. And I, accepted that. I felt like I flourished in the church. I always made decisions that aligned with those things. And, I feel like I received a lot of praise from my parents and from, other people in the church and the culture. And I felt like, those things also helped me form my identity. So I definitely felt like, that's who I was. And, as you know, in the Mormon church, one of the things that you learn as a child is, you sing songs. I am a member of this church, and it really does help form your identity. And in addition to the fact that, the belief that we're children of God, that helps us form an identity and kind of gives us an importance, right? And that in our purpose here on earth, a purpose to life, a purpose to our existence and to our family. And it kind of forms your understanding of what the world is all about. I ended up, I guess, going to college at BYU. It was my first choice. It was actually the only college that I applied to. I did everything I needed to do to try to go there. I felt like, I guess my parents, always wanted the best for me, but there is kind of a thing in the church when you grow up in the church that, they just assume if you're a good Mormon kid, you're going to continue on and go to BYU because that's what good Mormon kids do. And I think my dad always kind of felt like he wasn't really in the club per se with men leaders in the church, because a lot of the men leaders in the church had gone to BYU or knew each other at BYU, and they were kind of part of that club, right? And I think my dad always kind of felt like an outsider because he didn't have that experience. He also didn't serve a mission. He wasn't an Eagle Scout. And that just had to do with the fact that he didn't have those opportunities.
He didn't grow up as a Mormon.
And didn't grow up as a Mormon, but he always wished that he had, so he could, kind of feel a little bit more involved or a part of that club. And I think, I hate to say this, but I almost feel like he felt like almost a little less worthy because he hadn't done those things, right? And historically, I think and currently, I think if you really do look at the leaders in the Mormon church, you see that at least here in the United States and maybe even abroad, that a huge percentage of them really all did go to BYU, had that experience. You see the same types of patterns, right? And so part of my decision was definitely, I always wanted to make my parents proud. My identity, I think, was based around the fact that, like, my parents were really proud of me. I was following that path that I knew made them proud. I wanted to do that. I wanted to make them happy, make them proud.
So how was your experience at BYU? Did you have a good time?
I feel like, in retrospect, I did have a really, really good time. I think that the education at BYU is very religious focused. I feel like they, especially with history, they definitely try to mold their history classes to form kind of the religious narrative and support that religious narrative. One of the things I thought was interesting, after my BYU education, I was looking to potentially continue my education outside of that BYU system, and they were taking a look at the classes that I had taken for my bachelor's degree, and they said, "Oh, this is interesting. What is this history class? This doesn't look like U.S. history. What is this?" And at BYU, at the time, they called it American Heritage, but it was kind of U.S. history with that Mormon spin to it, right? And they actually saw that. They're like, I'm not quite sure if this fulfills that same requirement. You may need to take that again. And I definitely saw that. I mean, when I was there, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Mormons do have an interesting perspective on U.S. history. They really feel that the purpose behind the founding of the United States had to do with so that the church, the Mormon church, what refer to as the true church or true Christianity, the Christ church, could be established on the earth again. And so it's wrapped around that whole purpose, right? And so it's definitely not a kind of worldview. I did gain a certain amount of perspective growing up outside of Utah. Because I still grew up outside of kind of that Mormon bubble, I was able to see, that different perspective. The good thing is, at least the degree that I was pursuing, there were a lot of really talented people out there in the world that were able to come in. And
what was the degree that you pursued?
So I pursued a degree in illustration. I had a really good, art training in high school. And I know I wanted to, as a career, do something with my art and with that talent that I was blessed with. And so I kind of fell into that. But there were a lot of amazing Mormon illustrators that were able to, come in and be involved in that education. One interesting thing about BYU is because Mormons come from all over,
right?
You still meet people, albeit most of them grew up in the Mormon faith, but they're from all over, all over the world. That was really neat. But at the same time, I recognized then, and then even more so after the fact, that it was still a very sheltered, a sheltered environment, and all the classes and everything still kind of had that, kind of Mormon influence over that. Even while I was there were certain things that I thought, oh, that's an interesting perspective. I've never heard that before. I don't know if I agree with that. And I was never afraid to feel that way and never felt guilty for feeling that way.
Would you share, like, if you had questions, was it like in a class, like you would hear a professor say something and you'd be like, that's different? Like, would you ask them, or would you just kind of keep that to yourself, not to be outed?
Yeah, I would definitely keep that to myself. I would, because I'd be like, oh, okay. But like, I wouldn't raise, an issue, because assuming that a majority of the people kind of probably didn't feel that way. Right. Just as an example, I was taking a religious class. We actually had a substitute, and it was one of the required religion classes that, people may or may not know. When you go to BYU, you're required to take, and I forgot how many different credits, but at least once a year, maybe even every semester, you're required to take a religious class based on one of the texts.
I think the scriptures were mandatory to graduate. You would have had at least, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and then maybe church history or something like that.
Right. And so and I remember taking all of those. And I think I was in a church history class, and we had a substitute professor there who was talking about how, he felt really strongly that no one should ever get divorced, period, under any circumstances, because they were responsible for that other person's salvation.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, that is really interesting. And he even went into detail about how, I don't care if the person gets fat, you don't leave them. If they get in a tragic car accident and they're disfigured, you don't leave them, things like that. But from my perspective, I thought, well, that's silly. Why would someone leave somebody over that? But I'm automatically thinking, well, what about in cases of abuse?
Yes, of course.
Or what,
Did you ever mention that? Or?
No, but that's what's going through my head at the time. And I thought, oh my gosh, well, there's so many situations
where it would be justified.
Yeah, where I think that if people remained with someone under abusive circumstances, it would almost be like they were enslaved. And for what purpose? Because you can't get into heaven without being married to the other person.
Right.
And I just felt this overwhelming sense of dread, to be honest.
Yes.
And I thought, that's really extreme to make those blanket statements, because there's so many different life situations out there, right? But, I was never afraid of having differing opinions. My dad is a very outspoken individual. And my dad kind of went against his own parents, religion in a way. His parents had a really hard time when he and my mom joined the church. I think his dad even brought over a pastor to kind of exorcise the demons in the house.
Oh my goodness.
And I mean, it was pretty,
That's pretty drastic.
Pretty extreme. And I think was really hurtful to my father.
Right.
But my father also understood where my grandfather was coming from. But it wasn't easy, but I feel like, he still respected us for our potential differing opinions and for standing up for what we believe. And so I never felt like I had to think everything that my parents thought. My parents definitely raised us to be very independent thinkers. I think part of that had to do with the fact that my father was very outspoken. Mm-hmm. My mother was probably the opposite. But we definitely saw how important it was to speak our mind. And part of it maybe been just to kind of challenge my father.
Right.
It's like, oh, if we're going to be heard, we're going to have to be loud because he was a very outspoken, opinionated individual himself.
I understand you met your ex-husband at BYU, if I'm correct. So tell us about that and,
So I had just come back from serving a mission. I left on my mission when I was, 22 and a half. I had just completed my senior year. I still had a project I had to complete for part of my graduation requirements, and I wasn't able to complete it before it was time for me to go on my mission. I had decided to go on a mission because I really wanted the experience, and I felt like I had prayed about it, and it was something that God, supported me in doing. I was called to serve in the Carlsbad mission, Spanish speaking. I thought it was a really neat experience. It was going to be a really neat experience to learn Spanish and be able to proselyte, share my beliefs, but then also serve people. So I had come back to BYU. I still needed to finish that senior project that I didn't finish for my graduation requirements. So I came back, and during my first semester, I think probably 6 weeks into that semester, I ended up meeting my ex-husband through a mutual friend, and he was very involved in the church as well, so we had that in common. He also grew up in Southern California. His family was still there, and we really hit it off, but we felt like we were going to, be married in the church and start a family and raise our family in the church. And so a lot of my identity and a lot of our goals were definitely aligning. Yes. And it was all church centered, Right. And we, at that point, expected to raise our children in the church, and we were expected to fulfill certain roles, right? And I felt like the church supports women in careers if they have to work, but they would prefer them stay home to raise their children and that sort of thing. Starting out, we had children right away.
So how long did you date, and how long did it take between the moment you met and you got married?
So, great question. I feel like, and I don't know what the average is. I have no idea. But I mean, we met and we were engaged 6 weeks later, and we were married 6 weeks after that. So from the time that I met him and we were married,
12 weeks?
Yes, from the time that I met him, we were married was 3 months, which I had actually... I had known people at BYU that met and were married in 3 weeks.
Oh my goodness! So you were part of these crazy people.
But I feel like, I quadrupled that because I had known him for 3 months by the time we got married. Right?
Hold on. So I lived in. We lived in the same place, I think, at some point.
Right.
Because what year were you at BYU?
So I was at BYU from 98 to 2002. I went on my mission and I came back in January of 2004.
Okay, so we were there at the same time for a couple of years because
and living probably at the same apartment complex.
Right, which was
Liberty Square.
Liberty Square, yeah. Right. So I remember coming from Belgium and moving into these, student apartments and hearing just about every other day, oh, I'm engaged. Look, my ring, and I was like, what? These people are so young. I mean, they were, for the most part, they were younger than me because most of the young women there had not served mission, and I had served a mission. And I was already like 22, 23. I was like an old maid.
I felt old as well because I was 24.
Right. And I was 20. Just shocked.
And most of the girls got engaged or married at 19 or 20. And I mean, you were probably a similar age.
Yeah, I was like part of the old crowd. And so you were one of them. And I remember just shaking my head, even though I was super duper, super active Mormon and all in, I was like, that is insane.
Well,
and these people are there just to be married. That was my feeling, that they were at BYU just to find
which
a man.
that, you know, and they're not shy about it. They're not shy about the fact that, you know, the leadership, they encourage you to get married.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is your goal. When I came back from my mission, I mean, they remind you of what your goals need to be and not to get sidetracked. It's like, no, your goal here on earth is to find someone, marry them, have babies, raise them in the church. Yeah. And I was fully aware that I had a greater chance of finding someone at a Mormon person to marry at BYU than if I went out, right? Yeah. Went to a different state, because that's kind of where all the young Mormon people are. Right. And so I wouldn't say that I was, you know, crazy about it. Like, oh my gosh, I have to find someone and marry them. You know, I really, really felt connected to my ex-husband. We had a ton in common. Our families were very similar. Right. Your bases with very similar upbringings. And I guess the Mormon perspective is, well, don't wait, because if you screw up and have relations before marriage, have sex. Yes. If you have sex before marriage, it's going to screw everything up, and it puts your salvation literally in jeopardy. You can't get married in the temple, and everyone's going to know. If you can't get married in the temple, everyone's going to know it's because you had sex. Right. And it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to your so parents. It would absolutely be embarrassing. And so there definitely is a push that, don't be engaged for too long. If you're engaged, you have to get married quick so you don't mess up.
So just hold up. Like, I can't tell you how many people I met, you know, mostly, while I was at BYU and even after, who, I mean, just carry that weight of, you know, I had sex, you know, while I was a young adult. And either I even met, you know, I had this really sweet girl at BYU who had a kid, you know, and everything is out in the open, because of course, you know, people wonder, and she's a mom, and, you know, and she carries that, and she's such a sweet, I mean, I remember having no judgment, just thinking, oh, that must have been hard, you know, coming from Europe. I mean, you know, people don't really have kids that young in Europe, because they just have sex and they don't have kids. Like, I don't know, like young people. Yeah, right. But just in the Mormon community, carrying that, and then guys who had been divorced and they were like in their early 20s and they were like divorced. And I'm like, what is this? You know, how can you? Because they just basically got married to have sex. And I'm like, what kind of, you know?
Yeah. I actually, at BYU, I knew a girl who halfway through the semester went to Las Vegas with her boyfriend and got married. But they had were still under contract with their single people housing. So they came back and they were living in different apartments, but they were actually married.
It's just the insanity that goes on, because just going back to that, it's actually a guy, the guy I dated when I was at BYU. So he had been divorced, and basically told me, I got married so I could have sex, but then we had nothing in common. I got bored after a few weeks. You know, it's like, really? Yeah. Like, I mean,
but crazy. You know, and you only know kind of like how you're brought up and what you're counseled to do. Right. And I mean, my bishop wasn't this way, but I literally had a friend that lived less than a block away whose bishop said, my goal is to have at least 80% of you married by the end of the school year.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like,
and they just want, they don't care. There's no
wards.
Yeah. And so there's no counseling in regards to, well, first of all, there's no discussion whatsoever on important things that are important things to ask a potential spouse about their upbringing, maybe about their mental health, the mental health of their family.
As long as they're willing to be married in the temple and go to church every Sunday.
But that's it. If they go to church,
everything else
if they go,
matter.
If they have the same religion as you can make it work. So there's no what I would refer to as normal, sane discussion about, well, let's see, what type of upbringing did you have? You socioeconomic, you know, do you have, are there differences?
Race is, I mean, I don't know if now it's probably not as emphasized, but I remember growing up as like, just marry the same race, you know?
Wow.
Okay. That's going to be better.
You know, and I find that interesting, the whole race thing,
reality, because no, it has nothing to do with anything background and maybe socioeconomic, maybe, but
I find that really interesting in terms of marry the same race, because I think they think, well, if you don't, it's going to be culturally difficult or difficult for your children having these two identities. But I also think that it was very hypocritical, because then you send young men out all over the world where they fall in love with different cultures and meet women of different cultures and learn to appreciate their culture and meet these pretty girls, and then they end up marrying them. And so what they counseled, but then like what actually happened were totally different things. Because I've known so many different people that married someone from the country or the area of the world where they went and served their mission. I do think it's a beautiful thing that you meet someone and you fall in love with that culture, you know, and they make it work, and they make it work, and it's wonderful. But I find it very odd, though, that at any given point in time, culturally, you may not from the pulpit, even though it has happened, culturally, there was still kind of, it was stigma, you know, there was it was stigmatized.
It's not so, obviously, it hasn't been preached, you know, from the pulpit for probably decades, but you know how hard it is once you ingrain something, even if it's from a long time ago, for it to
be changed,
to change, and the mentalities, you know, it's just passed on. I mean, I can tell you from I served my mission on Temple Square, and they were literally, you know, people from all over the world. Some of them came back, you know, to the U.S. and I have, you know, stories upon stories of people telling me, well, you know, whether they were Asian or whatever, they were not accepted in the family because they were not white, you know, non-white or non-U.S. And so it persists. I mean, probably not as widespread as it used to be, but it's still there.
Well, yeah, you're right. And I feel like the culture and the religion are so overlapping that people have a hard time differentiating between something that may be doctrine and then something that is just cultural, right? And that has been passed down for generations and generations. And we know in the U.S., generationally speaking, there have been issues with that.
Right.
You know, something that was interesting also, but kind of speaking to things that you don't talk about that I think are important outside the church is make sure that you know the person you're going to marry enough to know that, for example, they don't lose their temper, that, you know, all the potential issues that might be there, you know, how they spend money, you know, different,
which is the cause of so many divorce in the long run, or unhappiness, because I always say that from my observation, sure, maybe 50% of people, you know, end up getting divorced for whatever reason, but among the 50% that remain married, I have seen so much unhappiness as well, because you kind of stuck in a situation, and like you were saying, like that teacher telling you guys not to divorce no matter what. I mean, a lot of people have that ingrained also in their mind, that divorce is just not an option. And so what is it? Medication, porn, you name it, like just not unhappy. So there's no discussion, there was never any discussion of mental illness, that mental illness was even a thing. The one time I had been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder actually while I was going to BYU. I was experiencing frequent panic attacks and severe social anxiety to the point where it had gotten so bad I was afraid to talk to people or even go to class and interact with another person. At kind of the height of what I was struggling with. But, you know, if you go to the church and you ask for help, which you're counseled to do, it's pray about it and get a blessing.
You get a religious response. You need to read, you know, more the scriptures more.
Go to temple.
You need to pray more, and then all these feelings will go away. And so they ignore the psychological and physiological potential reasoning behind all of that.
Did you ever see a counselor or anything like that? Because they do have counseling
available,
even though it's heavily, you know,
and a majority of it is their students
The counselors?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I never went.
a lot of them are getting their, I guess, hours towards their, trying to get their masters. It's all part of, at least the one that I saw. A lot of them were students. You can only see them once a month or once every 6 weeks because of the need.
Right.
And I was absolutely depressed, and then they just wanted me. They're like, "Well, you like to draw. Why don't you draw a picture of your feelings?" And I'm like, I was suffering from anxiety attacks, and this guy was, no experience. There were times where I woke up and I felt like I don't want to continue living like this. I wasn't contemplating suicide. All I knew was I wanted it to stop.
Yes. Yeah.
And I had actually suffered from anxiety attacks probably since I was 5 years old, but because of different things in my family, it wasn't focused on, and I didn't want to ask for help. I didn't know how to verbalize it.
Right.
And, but in college, with all the stress and everything that you have to juggle in college, it amplified. Right. And, again, I went to the church, and the guy said, well, if you are feeling overwhelming fear, maybe someone's stalking you.
What? What is that about?
And I'm like, I don't think someone's stalking me. It was
just random explanation to a situation they have no idea how to deal with.
Right. And I think now my father had himself had struggled with depression, anxiety, and different things while I was growing up. So my mother, now, albeit I feel like my brother was given kind of a skewed perspective on what all of that was, but talking with my mom, I really felt like, okay, let me come home for half of the summer and try to get this figured out so I can continue my education, because I really don't want to continue like this. I mean, that was a blessing in and of itself. I can absolutely say that the environment at BYU kind of did the opposite to help that situation, because I don't think they have the tools to help. Their perspective on it is all spiritual. Right. At least I felt like when I tried to get help, that's what it was. I just realized, okay, this isn't helping. Let me do whatever I have to do. Right.
So you kind of took it on your own, and we'll come back to this discussion, because that's something I really, that's very important to me, mental health. And I've had my own struggles, and I really want to kind of dig into it. I want to go back to then, and I know we're going to link all of this with you and your ex. Can we say his name or no?
Yeah, okay. We can call him my ex. Yeah.
Okay, let's call him your ex.
My ex-husband.
Yes. I think that's safe to say. But so we were 6 weeks altogether, 3 weeks of dating.
6 weeks of dating, 6 weeks of being engaged.
12 weeks, 3 months.
So, right. We were married. We were literally married 3 months later.
How do you even plan that?
Yeah. Well, and the thing with Mormon weddings is you don't have to pay for a venue.
Right.
You don't have to pay or arrange for clergy to facilitate that. And so it was fairly easy. The only thing we really had to do was find a photographer. I mean, and
the families were okay. Like your parents were okay.
And it's not abnormal at all in the church. Again, because I had known people that
families like what? I mean, that's way
well, in the way, I guess the perspective is, well, when you find the person that God wants you to marry, you just marry them. Yes, and it's like, oh, well, did you pray about it? Great.
Okay, you got your confirmation,
right?
From the Spirit, and
yes, and it was so funny. It's like, because how many times could that be convoluted when it's like, oh, you're young and you're hot and heavy and you're really attracted to someone and you want to have sex with them? Like, how is someone going to convince you this is a terrible idea? But there's just so much more that you don't know someone long enough to find out different nuances, struggles you could end up come running into, because it's not part of the discussion. It's never discussed.
Even with the bishop, who are supposed to be like your wise man telling you how to do things and how to prepare, like they don't even, I don't know, did you get like some because I know they do that, like whoever your bishops were, have a sit down with you, and what do they, I guess I had it too, I don't even remember. It was probably like a 5-minute ordeal. I don't even know.
Yeah. Honestly, the counseling I remember in regards to dating while I was at Liberty Square was, girls, you're not asking the guys out enough, because the guys are too shy. So you need to go get them. You need to go get them. Rawr,
Your job.
Yeah, which like you need to hold hands more. You guys aren't touching each other enough, but not too much. I mean, it was just. I remember thinking, right? This is like super bizarre.
Just make sure to be out of there by 11.
Yeah, and I think really the only counseling that we got when we were engaged was make sure you don't spend too much time alone together because you know you don't want anything to happen. And so
our push and pull.
Right. And, you know, there's no other discussion. You know, the interesting thing is my mother said, you know, it would be a good idea for you guys to find some sort of survey, some sort of test that you guys could equally take to see if you guys are on the same page with different things. Yeah, my mom actually said that.
Smart.
But I remember taking that and we really seemed like we were on the same page,
right,
you know, but a lot of that had to do with like sex, like if you'd want to have sex every day or once a week but how do you know if you've never even had sex before? How do you know what how would you even know what you're comfortable with or not comfortable with?
Guesstimation.
You know, how would you know if the other person has like these like ideas of what excites them or likes them? It's like because you have no idea, and not only that, they encourage you to not explore it.
Right. So like really you're going two blind people going into
correct
something.
And so I mean this is just an example and I hope it's not too graphic, but I mean what if one of those people, their idea is like BDSM and then the other person, that's like not even on the radar of most people.
That's just a realm that,
you know, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, but like if you can't discuss something you know nothing about.
Absolutely.
And
it's basically pointless to try to figure out what is it you like or don't, since you don't know and you're going to discover that as you go.
And so you're really going into it blind. And I think, you know, it's the closest you can get to in a church, a religious arranged marriage.
Yeah, pretty much.
That you can get. Let's just be honest, because the only criteria is that
be faithful and
right, and they seem like they're somewhat functioning. But if they go to the church temple once a week, and they go to church every Sunday, then you know, and there's so much literal. In which I read on my mission, there were literally from the pulpit, they're frequently speaking, you marry any faithful person and it will work, and it's the only thing that matters. I feel like there's a lot more that goes into that, right? Absolutely. And so that's a huge issue. I think it's worth, you know, a lot more discussion in the future. And so there's a lot of things we can talk about.
We'll see what they've done with it, because you know we do know that the church does make baby steps progress on, you know, every area, even though it's super duper slow. But I do think that they try at least to, you know, inform better and you know,
and I feel like, you know, a lot of things also
dispense of knowledge ever slowly and carefully.
And you know, also a lot of things that I think the rest of the world sees as kind of a state of being, they see as a temptation, correct?
Right.
Such as, you know, sexual preference, they see that as temptation, right? Different things like that. Those are extremely important things.
Yes.
They would be absolutely important in a marriage, but it's such a taboo, you would never want to discuss it. So I think it's so easy for people to fall into a situation.
Chastity,
right.
Don't tempt.
Right. You fall into a situation where you're
properly, modesty.
Right.
Yeah.
You end up marrying someone that has tendencies, but they're ashamed to even talk about those tendencies, so they never get brought up.
Right.
And then they end up coming out during periods of stress in your relationship, and you know, you end up thinking like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Had I known, maybe a different, you know, I would have made a different decision. Because with those, what we could say temptations, how they view it, right? I think it puts pressure on the relationship, and I think it decreases the opportunity for success. And I feel that is unjust and unfair. They're not allowing people to speak openly, and there's definite shame involved, and denial.
Right.
So my ex-husband and I married in the summer of 2004, and he was still actually finishing school, but I mean, he worked while he was finishing school. I was working. We actually got pregnant right away, which was totally a normal thing because everybody that gets
Right.
married at BYU has a kid. We actually ended up bringing our daughter home from the hospital on our 1-year anniversary.
Oh, wow.
She was almost born on our 1-year anniversary. She was before
speed train.
Right. But I mean, that's just what you do. And that's the
Right.
cultural norm, right? And I remember my mom telling me, hey, you need to wait, at least a year before you have a kid. And so I'm like, hey, we waited a year. I think she meant wait a year before you decide to have a child.
Right.
We did kind of like, hey, we brought her home. We waited a year, right? And so, we started out, I mean, very, very young, early on in our marriage, like raising a child. And I went to work because my ex-husband at the time, wasn't 100% sure what he wanted to do. But I felt like, he was a hardworking guy. He always worked the whole time, sometimes more than one job while he was going to school.
Right.
And I just figured, he's gonna figure it out.
Right.
We ended up staying around BYU for a few years. Things around 2008 started getting really rough, as everyone I'm sure remembers.
So that's how many years at that point?
So we had been married for 4 years, we decided, since we were both working, and my thought, and we were supporting ourselves, but I thought, long term, I don't want to set ourselves up to where I have to work, because again, kind of like that cultural goal is to have the mom be at home raising the kids. Right. And so we thought around 2008, and we actually made the decision before the market crashed. Right. We decided to move back to Texas, move in with my parents, so we could save some money. The economy was still, when we made that decision in 2008, the economy was still going really strong. There were a lot of jobs, but what we ended up, so moving in with my parents, actually the same week the market crashed, which was dismaying because I was unable to find work. All the jobs that we had seen online before we made that decision were all frozen. Okay. And so I ended up just staying home with our daughter. My ex-husband ended up with a job, with the city, and which wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do initially, but it was, I need to support my family. Right. And we're living with my parents under their household. My parents were very, very active in the church. I think at the time they were probably temple workers. And, but we did have that support. We were trying to save money, but, when my ex-husband started, working for the city. He started going out with those different people. And then at one point he asked me, he said, what would you do if I left the church? And I said, and I was totally taken aback. I was shocked. And I said,
so you didn't see anything coming? Like he wasn't being like inactive or things like that?
No, he was teaching Sunday school.
Okay.
And everybody really liked him, and he, loved teaching he was teaching like the teenagers or something. And we would still go to the temple every once in a while. So, but he asked me one day, what would you do if I left the church? And I was so shocked, because he had never expressed any doubts to me at all whatsoever. And it seemed like it was completely out of the blue. And I said, well, I would leave you, because I saw that as, if you leave the church, you want nothing to do with this family, because this family was built on the foundation of the church. So I thought that was kind of what he was saying. That's what he was telling me. And it was the very next day, he told me, well, I'm leaving the church. I don't believe any of it. So after I told him, well, I would leave you, I felt like that's what he wanted. Okay. Because he said, what would you do? Wow. And then he said, well, I'm done with the church. Yeah. So I said, well, clearly something's going on. I actually packed up his things while he was at work. Wow. And set them by the door for him, because I felt like that was him saying, I don't want to be in the marriage. So I packed up his things, and I was just in shock. I felt like that admission was also saying, I don't love you and I don't want the family. I think it was probably a drastic decision on my part. After a couple of days,
it was a reaction.
Correct. Correct.
An emotional reaction.
after a couple of days, he ended up confiding in me that no, he still loves me and loves the family. He just doesn't want anything to do with the church.
And what was his reasons for that?
He wouldn't go into detail.
Okay.
He just said he didn't believe it. And in fact, that very next Sunday, within a couple of days, he actually just walked into the bishop's office while they were having their meeting and handed in his manual and handed in his temple recommend and said, thanks, bye, I'm done.
Wow.
And he had always been someone that didn't care what anyone else thought. I was devastated. I feel like I may have been more devastated with him leaving the church than even when we were divorced. I mean, I didn't sleep the night before. I had just cried, because I thought what goes along when somebody says they're done with the church is, oh, I'm now going to cheat on you and start drinking and doing drugs and all these different things, because that's why people leave the church, so they can do really bad things. Right. And that's really what it has to do with. So he never told me it had to do with any religious or doctrinal doubts or anything like that. And he just wouldn't talk about it. And I think in retrospect, it was probably because he didn't want me to go down that same path. Right. Didn't want me to have those same doubts or same issues, because that could potentially cause a conflict with my family. And it was different from what I said I wanted. So he never said anything to me. Did you ever in the future tell you what were the original reasons? So that's still a mystery to you. All right. I think it ended up being kind of everything. A mixture. Right. He never expressed any doubts to me the whole time we were married. And he grew up in the church as well. He did grow up in the church. As a teenager, he kind of had a couple of wild years here and there where, he did normal teenage things outside the church, but then he would always come back, and he ended up serving a mission as well. So he always came back to the gospel and, and a lot of teenagers do that. It was interesting because being in that perspective, an active Mormon, I was then faced with the decision, what do I do when my spouse has said they want nothing to do with it? And it was hard for me because part of my identity and part of what I thought I wanted out of life was gone, which was that active member that was going to baptize my children, that was going to, be that priesthood holder and that leader in our family. Didn't exist. Right. So I felt like that was abandoned, and that was really hard for me. The decision I had to make was, so what am I going to do? Am I going to accept him how he is? And ultimately the decision that I made was, I love him no matter what. Okay. And I would rather be with him, not in the church, than be with someone else. So you did choose to put the couple before. Right. Because because I loved him that much. And for me, that's what it meant. And for me, it was, should be. And for me, it was more important than the church. And I wasn't going to let the church convince me otherwise. Right. And I also felt that I wanted to not really save him, but my thought was, I will follow him to the ends of the earth. I will follow him to hell and go get him if I have to, So it was less of me wanting to save him and more of me just being committed to him and loving him no matter what, right? And I felt like his decision wasn't, even though some people may feel differently, I wanted to respect him for his belief, as he was still respecting me and allowing me to continue to go to church, and he was allowing me to raise the kids how I wanted to raise them. And I felt like he was extending that respect to me, and I wanted to do the same for him. So I decided to support him in his beliefs, and it was extremely difficult, but it's what I wanted. I wanted to love him and be with him no matter what. And that was most important to me. I wasn't going to choose between my spouse and the church. Around that time, we were trying to have our second child. We ended up having 2 miscarriages, which was devastating to me. I feel like also when I was kind of going for a couple of days, I was deciding, well, should we get divorced because he's leaving the church or not? I realized, well, do I really want that? Do I really want to have children with someone else? Because this was the person I always wanted to have children with. And part of me was like, no, this is crazy. Of course I want to have more children with this person, with this man. And I feel like that was part of the reason why I said, no, I absolutely accept him how he is, and it's okay. because we only had our one daughter. I never wanted just one child. I didn't want to start over with someone, feel like I was starting over with someone else just based on the church. So, we were trying to have another child. The 2 miscarriages, were devastating. I never in my mind did I think that was a sign that we weren't supposed to be together. Because I was like, no, forget that. I kind of don't believe in signs in that regard. Some people feel like, I know a lot of people where they've been with a spouse and they've had a hard time and had a miscarriage and saw that as a sign that they didn't need to be with them.
Interesting. I've never really heard of that.
A number of
I can relate with, having miscarriage and how devastating that is. When you're ready to, whether you're ready or not, to have kids, but especially if you really want to have children and then, that happens. And that's yes, I think women live that differently than men. Right. For sure.
And I felt at the time, I didn't have, I feel like at the time, or I guess after the fact, I did have some friends come out and confide in me that they had a miscarriage, but it took months. And I wish, and it wasn't until I openly said something about it or mentioned online that it had happened before my friends mentioned it. And I thought, what is the taboo around this?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's quite, from what I've read and just speaking to friends and other women, it's fairly common. It's not always talked about. I mean, now more than
I guess it could be.
Before,
it could be. I mean, almost. They think that a third of all pregnancies ended miscarriage, and a lot of times before women even know that they're pregnant.
And many have multiples, and I mean, the whole. All the issues around, pregnancies and not being able to be pregnant. I mean, it's
and I feel like there's a lot of shame involved, especially with women, because you feel like you screwed up.
Right.
You did something wrong.
It's not always the fault of the woman either. I mean, it can come from, the man as well. But I think there is an additional weight when you are member of the church, member of a church who emphasizes so much having children and having the family, and you don't talk about that in Relief Society or whatnot. I mean, I think because you feel shame or you feel you're not up to. I mean, I remember the pain of people I knew in the church who couldn't have children and were around all these families, and family, and the definition that the church gives of family. Families are together forever and this and that, and the children have to be included. Little by little, you saw in Relief Society talks in General Conference a little bit a mention of, and then how Sherry Dew kind of changed that image of the woman being full and accomplished because she was a single woman, and that was
which added validity to that. Added validity to that.
The worth of a woman, whether she has kids or not. I mean, I think she did she did a lot of good things in that sense for just lifting up women, regardless of, you're single, you're married, you have kids, you don't have kids, but still, just like anything else, because of what was taught, in the earlier stages of the church, that, you should have a lot of kids and, that's the role of a woman. And, when you couldn't
and
do
the value
that,
and the value of a woman. Yeah.
And the more, the merrier. And when you couldn't have that, or you didn't fit that mold, the pain, I have felt the pain of, even me prior having kids, I felt like I was old, which is such a silly, stupid idea. I was in my early 20s or mid 20s and didn't have kids and felt like, oh my gosh, I'm behind. Like, even that thought of being behind is absolutely ridiculous, right? But where does that come from, if not from what you've been taught growing up?
Right. That doctrine and that cultural pressure.
Where does that come from? Where does that guilt come from? And, that shame and whatnot.
And I'm not, and I know every woman needs to deal with that in their own way, and you grieve in your own way and things like that, and not everyone wants to talk about it because they are ashamed. And I completely understand that. But again, I think that definitely added some extra pressure, and the type of pregnancy that the second miscarriage, or excuse me, the first miscarriage that I had was a type of pregnancy that could have threatened my life, and I had to be monitored, and I wasn't supposed to get pregnant for a whole year after that. So we ended up, having to wait to try again. And that was an extremely difficult period also. So, fast forward, I guess, to, I did end up getting pregnant. I gave birth to my son. I almost died while having him. And I was blessed to, they were able to save my life and the life of my son. And I'm so grateful for that. And my son was 9 months old, though. And my husband at the time took me to dinner. We went to dinner, I guess, on a Friday or Saturday evening. And he had been drinking, and I knew that. That was just part of his lifestyle choice with leaving the church. And he, I think, downed, I don't know, it was like 2 or 3 shots, big shots, really quickly, and said, "I want a divorce," over dinner. And
while you were 9 months pregnant?
Excuse me, this is after we had my son.
After you had your son.
My son was 9 months old.
9 months old, okay.
He said, "I want a divorce." And I was shocked. And I said, "I don't think we should talk about this here. I really don't want to do this in a public place." And so I got up to leave, and he yelled at me as I was walking off, "I'm not in love with you anymore. When we have sex, it's just sex."
Oh my gosh.
And so that was just devastating. I was like, what is going on? He thought that he was just going to stay living with me, and we were going to sleep in the same bed and everything until the divorce was final.
Wow.
And he didn't have any plans on how that was going to look or what was entailed in that. The very next day that the courts were open, he drove me to the courthouse and said, here's the papers, you need to sign them. This is what we're doing. Wow. I cried the entire way there. He was just completely emotionless.
No regards whatsoever for your position. I mean, that sounds
well, and he actually had me quit my job.
Cruel.
He had me quit my job before he did it, which was worse. And when I told him, "Well, you can't stay here. We're not sleeping in the same bed. You just told me you wanted a divorce."
Home at that point, still we were still house.
Right. And he basically, I had a job while I was pregnant with my son, kind of for insurance purposes. I was only making like $9 an hour. It wasn't the job that my career was, if that makes sense. Yes. It was just kind of a temporary type of a thing, but he had me quit that.
Wow.
I think maybe because he knew what he was planning, and he thought I'd want to go back to a better paying job, my design career. But things were still extremely difficult. The economy was still down. Right. There weren't a lot of jobs at that point. I would have preferred keeping the one job that I had, but he didn't give me that choice, because he said, "Hey, why don't you just quit and stay home with the kids?" But when he left also, he decided he wasn't going to pay any of the bills. There was no plan for that. He wasn't giving me any child support. He just left, and I had a car, I had a car payment. I had all this stuff, but he figured since he left me at my parents' house, they were going to help take care of that.
They're going to take care of everything.
So anyway, that was really devastating. He never told me why. He just said he didn't love me, and there was no explanation. So I assumed he had an affair. Something was going on. I did find out through phone records that he was clearly conversing with and texting someone else that ended up being a woman. He told me that no, they were just friends. That wasn't what was going on. Ultimately, it wasn't until I think it was about 6 months after we were actually divorced, and we didn't even get attorneys. We just downloaded the paperwork from online. Wow. And he didn't even read it. He didn't read anything that was in it, and then just signed it and done. So we had been married for just over 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, and so we had 2 kids. My son was, I think by the time the divorce was final, my son was about a year old. He had left a few months before that. And so I was at home with these 2 kids without a job, living under and that wasn't a good mental place for me to be, because I had been abandoned at my parents' house. My father then stepped in and with the attitude that, well, your husband, that the leader of your family is now gone. And so I'm the priesthood holder. I'm going to step in as that priesthood holder in charge of you and your kids.
Wow.
I didn't take that very well.
No. No.
Because at this point, I was 31 years old. I had been married. I had been separated from my parents. I had my children. I wasn't ready to go under, quote unquote, my father felt like,
patriarchy.
Yes, he needed to take charge of me again, and I wasn't okay with that.
How did they take the divorce, though? Like, were they...
They were really disappointed in the situation. They thought he had kind of lost his mind. He told them, well, we've just grown apart, but we actually had always gotten along. We never had any issues. The only quote unquote issues I felt like came up, I felt like he struggled.
He got bored in the marriage?
I felt like he actually struggled with depression, and there were some things that I could never get to. When we were still living in Utah, we pursued therapy and going to a counselor because he thought, I don't think we should be married anymore. And then I said, why? He's like, I just don't feel anything. And I'm thinking, that sounds like depression to me. Let's try to pursue this. But of course, the way that you pursue that in Utah is you tell your bishop what's going on. The bishop says, oh, I'll give you a referral for a counselor, but it's an LDS counselor.
Right.
And the questions they ask, well, are you guys studying? Are you guys studying the scriptures
related
together?
Yes.
And they were never, ever, ever going to get to another level because they never assumed that maybe there's some mental illness going on. Maybe there's prior abuse where people have a lot of things they need to work out. Like, what is actually happening here? It was never going to get to that. Literally, the questions they were asking was, do you go on dates?
Do you feel like maybe the divorce could have been avoided had these issues been addressed at the very beginning when you thought it was depression, but clearly it was some different mental illness? Like, if measures have been taken to try to address that.
Yeah, I think, I think potentially,
stages.
But I think what ended up ultimately like coming out and being uncovered was so much deeper than I nor he would ever figure out. I think if these things were uncovered from the very, very beginning, neither of us would have gotten married. Okay. Because I think what was truly uncovered was the fact that like both of us were probably way too immature to be married. There were things that we didn't even understand about our own lives, our own upbringing. I think ultimately, I married someone who had what we could say is an emotional attachment disorder. I mean, what is that? Growing up in a religion and a culture that there's no discussion around mental illness, that mental illness isn't real. Right. A lot of stake presidents have no idea what it is, potentially think that people with schizophrenia are just having a crisis, but with Satan, Satan's trying to control them, and that it's not something that's actually psychological or physiological going on. I discovered, I guess, that based on the kind of family situation and potential psychological abuse that my ex-husband had suffered as a young child affected the way that he processed things. Absolutely. He never properly dealt with those things. He had no idea how he was capable or incapable of having a relationship or bonding with another person. What ultimately ended up coming out, and it was because after my divorce, I was seeking understanding for what happened. And I wasn't going to get it for him because he didn't even understand it himself. So ultimately, I ended up finding a therapist. Now, I was in the South, or at least in Texas, there's a lot of therapists that advertise themselves as being Christian therapists or Christian-based therapists. I wasn't looking for that because I felt like it was so drastic from what I grew up with. I was like, oh no, I'm not trying to get into yet another religious perspective. That's going to tell me to pray about it. So I specifically reached out and found a therapist who did not advertise as being a Christian therapist, and by pure chance, if we want to call that, or the universe, I ended up finding a woman therapist that I didn't know this at the time, and it wasn't advertised, was actually an inactive Mormon woman herself, which is very interesting and very unique because she was a Mormon career woman, not very many of those, but she had told me that she had kind of separated herself from the church, but she was not going to counsel people using the church's guidelines, right? So she didn't counsel for the church because she didn't agree with their guidelines. Right.
at least understood the background and where you were coming
Correct.
from.
She totally understood. And it was by complete chance, because I was going in there seeking guidance and saying, I was raised Mormon. This is what happened. My spouse did this. Please help me understand this. Help me understand what potentially happened. We were able to uncover somewhat some clues as to potentially where my ex-husband's mindset was, some clues as to
what could have caused the behavior.
And we were actually able to uncover that potentially he had an issue with an emotional attachment disorder, and that's where someone, I guess, at a young age, a critical part of their upbringing, through, I guess, psychological or emotional abuse, learns to shut off that human connection, that deeper emotional connection with a parent figure. And when they do that at such a young age, and they do that as a survival mechanism, I guess just protection, right? To protect themselves. But in so doing, they prevent themselves from doing that in the future, right? Without help or guidance or a lot of
hurting other people in the process of
right. And so what he felt he was unattached to me actually was true, but it had nothing to do with me not trying. It had nothing to do with a lack of love and care and attention in our own relationship. It had to do with he literally couldn't have a deeper emotional connection with another human being without pursuing that at a really deep level, and it would have to be his choice. And what was difficult for him is he didn't know what he was missing.
Right, because he never digged into it or looked into it, or
he felt like there was a hole inside that he couldn't fill. And so I started researching that whole thing so I could understand where he was coming from. It helped a lot when I found out that what had happened was he started pursuing these sexual relationships while we were married, because he was trying to get that emotional fulfillment through excitement and through chasing and through because his needs weren't met emotionally. But without pursuing that, those things, pursuing all those sexual relationships, doesn't actually fulfill any of that long term,
because it's emotional and not sexual.
And so our human nature, we want and we strive and we need, probably at a spiritual or soul level, we need that human connection. But unless he's able to resolve those things, it didn't matter. And it wasn't just me. It would have happened to anyone that he had married. And once I realized that, I was finally able to heal. And and I'm not saying I was perfect and there wouldn't have been anything I could have done, but but that's some serious stuff.
Absolutely.
That how are you supposed to uncover something like that if the counseling just has to do with, how often do you go on dates?
Yes.
That doesn't reach those types of things, and they don't even attempt to do that, right?
You have to dig deeper.
Right. And so I actually think through my pursuit of counseling and therapy, trying to help myself heal and find ways to heal, I was able to understand the situation that I was in. And later on, I ended up sharing those potential things with my ex. He, I think has a greater understanding of maybe some of the difficulties that he has. And
Did he ever pursue counseling himself?
I know he has from time to time. And I think it's probably something that he just realizes he's always going to have to deal with. He doesn't feel a strong need or desire to pursue it on a different level.
It's difficult.
Because he doesn't feel that drive, because he doesn't understand what he's missing. And even though he knows that there's like a hole there, and the more I've looked into this particular issue, it takes a really, really long time, and you actually have to break someone down at like a core level, an emotional level, almost get them in an infantile state, almost emotionally, to be able to rebuild that. And it's extremely difficult. And I don't, whether or not he eventually takes the time to explore that on his own. I mean, I've encouraged him to, because I said, if you could understand,
a better person, a
correct
whole person, if he does that.
And I feel like if he could ever understand how beautiful and wonderful it is to have a deeper emotional connection with someone than I think he and I were able to have. We were great friends. We got along great. I loved him, but I always felt like there was this lack of, and we truly, I think, had 1 or 2 arguments the whole time we were married, which actually that should have been a red flag in retrospect, because we never truly got to that deeper emotional level where you actually can hurt people in a different way. Right. But we just never got there. I knew there was something missing a little bit because I had dated growing up and I had had a deeper emotional connection with people. But, you know, so I've encouraged him to, you know, at some point I said, it will be really rewarding if you're ever able to have that.
This is so valuable information, because I think it happens all the time, you know, even with, you know, people rebuilding and trying to have those connections. You know, I'm thinking of my own current relationship as you speak, and really being honest with the type or the level of emotional connection you have. First of all, being on the same page, because we do know that, you know, there's all sorts of relationship out there, and some people are seeking for different things. But if you're looking for something serious long term, to really be honest with that emotional connection. Is it there, and how deep is it? Or because that's what eventually is going to cause problems if you don't have it, or if you aren't able to communicate on a really deep level.
And I felt, and it was something I think when we were dating, I felt like, you know, this is just great. We just get along so well. And it was hard to put my finger on it. And, but again, it's, when there's not a language for it, culturally speaking, where it's not discussed, how do you talk about something that you feel is there, but there's no word, there's no way to put it into words? And so, you know, I think in addition to this specific thing, I think it's so important for people to explore their own emotional well-being, explore what they've been through, and maybe what those effects are on yourself mentally and emotionally, and how it could affect how you deal with things. So you are coming to the table with an understanding of who you are.
Absolutely.
But then also start to form, and start to form a language and to be where we can talk about and communicate culturally with people in regards to mental illness, or just where people could potentially be coming from. Because not just that, I mean, we're talking like depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety. There's so many things that can play into how someone acts or how someone relates to someone else. And without that understanding, I feel like relationships can be destroyed because there's just a lack of knowledge.
Absolutely. And it stays on the surface, and you get hurt, but you don't try to dig deeper. And absolutely. And you just kind of go your way, either because it's too hard, or but I do believe what you say, that it starts at a personal level of understanding, where am I at? Because I believe that we all have our issues. It's part of being humans. Now, we all have a level of crazy. We all have a level of, you know, whatever it is that we deal with that's difficult. And it's a matter of being aware and brave enough to look at it and to understand it. I always say everyone should go to therapy, because we all have nuts inside that needs to be undone, and almost impossible to do on your own.
Yeah, based on our own experiences. Right.
You can't do that on your own, because you need someone to, first of all, help you looking. That's why people go to school and
help you see
study,
things, right? Help you see things from a different perspective, and look at things in a different way.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And yes, it's hard, and yes, it hurts, but it makes you so much better afterwards, and also better in a relationship if you wish to be in a relationship. So I'm so I hope you will probably hear me say that over and over, but it's so important to deal with this.
Okay, so this definitely kind of sets me up to that phase of rebuilding, right? Because I felt like with my marriage ending, a lot of my identity went out the window, right? I shortly after my divorce. I ended up moving out of my parents' house. I found a full-time design job, which was going to be able to support myself and my kids. So we moved into an apartment because I felt like that added, and it could have just been perceived pressure from my parents, but kind of that attitude of that priesthood holder. It's okay, I'm going to be in charge of your family now. I'm going to take you under my wing. Like, that was too much for me. I needed a level of independence. I wasn't ready to accept that. So I ended up moving out with my kids. We found an apartment. Things were going well. So I was going through those steps of grieving. It was almost like I was grieving a death. And I would say that it was like the death of not just my marriage, but how I perceived my life was going to go. Because I hadn't written into what I wanted out of life. Oh, divorce. Like, that wasn't in my life plan. That wasn't the way things were going to work out. So I was grieving the death of that. And it was hard because with that, again, went my identity. I felt like I no longer had a foundation. At this point, I had a 6-year-old. My son was a baby who had just turned 1 when we moved out on our own, and I continued trying to go to church, and it was extremely difficult. My son was very, very hyperactive. He was mobile, but he was too young for the church nursery. So what it ultimately ended up happening was I would go to church for 3 hours and
spending time in the hallways
and chase my son. Now, the way that culturally that works in the Mormon church, the husband and the wife switch off so that they can receive some sort of spiritual edification and instruction in one of the different environments, like the big sacrament meeting or the Sunday school or the meeting with the men or the women, right? Relief Society and priesthood. But I was chasing my very hyperactive 1-year-old around, and it just got to the point where I thought, this is crazy. I am going to church for 3 hours to chase a baby around hallways. And I would kind of just chat and get into discussions with people, just trying to get to know people, other people my age. But then I also realized that I started feeling aggression from women if I was speaking to their husbands, because I was divorced, and I felt like that they were afraid that I was after their husband, or they felt threatened by me because I was divorced, that there was something that I wanted.
It makes people question. I can say that as a newly divorced woman, that there is that stigma about I don't know, like, divorced women are going to hit on the married man, and not to say that it never happens, because in this world, this crazy world we live in, I'm sure it does happen, but it just puts you in a weird situation, especially when you're not in that mindset or that mind frame.
Right.
But it also tells me that if you are so insecure in your own marriage that you're afraid of a single woman around, or if your husband's so weak that he would fall for whatever single woman or divorced woman walks by, that's an issue in your marriage.
And again, people didn't know. Correct. And people didn't know why I was divorced. For all they knew, I was cheating on him, or I was looking, my eyes were wandering, and so there's all these assumptions, and I was seen as a threat. And the kind of microaggressions, I guess you could say, it's a term people use now, a lot of microaggressions from women that were my age, and a lot of them were still having children or were pregnant, and they were saw me as that threat, having been someone that had been cheated on. Come to find out, my ex had actually slept with my best friend in the ward, which was devastating on this whole other level. And I never would have done anything even remotely like that. I wasn't looking for someone. What I was really looking for was help. And I expressed that need to the elders of the church, to the bishop, that I needed help. I would like to attend class. I would, I think one person helped me once watch my son, but they don't want to miss their class to watch someone else's kid.
Right.
But who needs spiritual edification more than a newly divorced woman whose spouse had left, who needs spiritual edification, who literally cannot attend class, cannot attend anything. And I felt really that the church was inflexible.
Yeah.
To help people to help single women with children, and especially what ended up being, my son ended up having special needs, having a pretty severe mood disorder, having these other issues that ultimately was going to keep him out of the classroom, and that I wasn't, as a single mom, I was not going to be able to go to church and get anything from church, and so from time to time I would go with my parents, but ultimately I just stopped going.
Isn't that ironic, though, that you're supposed to be able to go there, be filled, recharge your batteries, but then if you're not if things, if you're not that, couple with whatever, helping each other, and if you're just a little off the picture perfect, like, it just doesn't work.
Right. There was
it just doesn't work. Like, you just,
there was literally no support for that. And the bishop just said, well, no, your son's too young for nursery. We're not going to keep him in there just because you want to go to class.
Job,
and
unquote,
right. And there's complete inflexibility. And I think that, unfortunately, that they're just hurting themselves, because how many families are a single parent household with children that want to receive spiritual edification, but have a situation or a child with needs where no one's going to watch them while you get something out of church, and I feel like it was the opposite of that. I even expressed at one point, I will give them credit. I mean, the stake presidency visited me because I fell apparently under their care and guidance. I mean, since I was a divorced woman, probably they also didn't want young men visiting who are married and didn't want them visiting a newly divorced woman. So that's probably why these older gentlemen, I fell under their care. They came to visit me to see what they could do for me. I told them what they could do for me, and I got nothing because they didn't do that and they weren't flexible in that way. Some of the women were nice enough to, like one of them gave me a whole bunch of clothes that, that was really helpful and nice. I was working. But at one point, she offered me, she was, I guess, my visiting teacher. She offered me some guidance and said, are you wanting to get remarried? And I said, well, yeah, eventually, but it's like when you're in your early 30s, most men who are in their early 30s who, are available haven't gotten married for one reason or another, or there's just not limited pool at that time period, right?
If you're gonna limit it to church,
my bishop literally said, be careful of the men who aren't married, because a lot of, at this point in age, because a lot of them are predators.
Wow.
In the church. And I'm like, yikes. Okay. Yeah. So I started trying to go to single things, but I wasn't really to be honest, there wasn't anyone I was really interested in. Right. My visiting teacher at the time said, honey, you're probably going to have to marry someone whose wife has passed away, who's in his 50s. What? And at this point, I'm 31. I'm 31, and so I still feel really young.
Because you are.
Yeah, and I'm not looking. She's like, you're going to have to start dating men in their 50s. And that didn't occur to me at that point. And I thought, this isn't what I want.
This is so
and what I'm looking for isn't here. So it really started, it kind of lit a fire under me. And I really felt the inflexibility of the church and me not being heard prompted a lot of
the questioning and wondering.
Yeah, I started to question, how is it that the church that is supposed to be, the God that's supposed to be listening to me, the prophets that are supposed to be listening to the needs of the church, and the leadership that's supposed to be listening, why are my needs not being met? I need spiritual edification. I'm not getting it. And why is that? So I started really researching and being open to those things. Now, one of the reasons that I felt I justified researching and looking into, historicity, I guess, of the church claims.
Hold on. So at that point, you felt like your needs aren't met. So basically, maybe subconsciously, you're trying to find a way out.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, subconsciously, I was trying to find like a reason, more or less. I wanted to justify in my mind why it was okay
to leave.
That they weren't supporting me. Why, and if I was going to be okay with that. And so I was truly trying to find only true church, right, on the face of the earth. Like, you should have solutions to my small and I'm like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And how is it okay? And so that's really what I was exploring. And, I've never been afraid of knowledge. I've never been afraid of knowledge. There was, that has just always been something that I've felt. Something else, I guess, that stuck with me from my mission, when we would go teach people, one of the things that I noticed when we would tell people about the Book of Mormon, and we would explain to them what it is, I remember on a number of occasions people saying, "Oh, my pastor said I shouldn't read that." And I remember having a reply or coming back with, "Well, if you don't read it, how are you ever going to know for yourself? Are you going to allow your pastor to make that decision for you? And you can't find out for yourself." So I believed that. I believed that people should be able to absorb any knowledge and be able to discern for themselves what is right and wrong. So conversely, I was not going to be a hypocrite and say, "Oh, except for information that might be potentially damning or harmful to the church and the claims that they have, I should still be able to read whatever," because I also grew up with the belief and the understanding that I had the light of Christ within me, or a certain amount of discernment
to help you know what's right and
to help me what's right and what's wrong. I should be able to absorb any information out there
and not be afraid
of it.
Yes.
Something on a deeper level raised a red flag for me, but always had, that you shouldn't tell people not to seek knowledge of any kind, while telling them they have the power and the blessing of discernment.
Are you referring to, like, don't read the anti stuff?
Correct.
Or don't go and,
correct,
like the anti-Mormon or whatever.
Correct.
Like they're telling lies about us. Well, what are those lies? And let me check if they are lies.
Right. But you don't even have that option. They're making that decision for you.
Right. They're like, stay away
from it.
But
if we've been truly blessed with what the Mormon Church refers to as the light of Christ, you should be able to know if something is true or not. And you should be able to read whatever you want. And you will know that stuff is not true.
You can figure that out on your own.
Right. And so the seeking and this desire for knowledge around this time period wasn't to find a way out. It truly wasn't. It was to justify what I was seeing as some form of like injustice.
Okay.
And kind of being ignored. And I kind of started seeing things because I was truly hurt. And, people say, "Oh, people just get a chip on their shoulder and they leave." And it wasn't that. I wasn't looking for that reason. I was trying to understand, and I was trying to justify their position, because I had already justified the same things that every other member justifies in terms of polygamy, or, blacks in the priesthood, or all those things. Everyone justifies that, with different historical things. And I was trying to justify my own personal situation.
Okay, that's interesting.
And but what I found was, I guess you could say, the opposite. I was reaching for peers, just people I needed to start rebuild my own identity. So I started trying to meet people. I actually met people, I'd get on one of the dating sites, but I was actually kind of just looking for people that have been through a similar thing as me. So, I met other single individuals that had just been through a divorce, and people that I wouldn't necessarily have a relationship with, but just people I could go out with, that I could connect with people.
Your situation.
And start to have friends and start to rebuild a life, something, because I needed that. I needed something.
As any human being does.
Right. Yeah. And, someone mentioned something to me once and said, "Well, what about the Book of Abraham?" And I said, "What?"
That was someone from your new circle?
Correct. Yeah. Just people that were my age, that were still single. Some of them had been married, been divorced.
So that sounded like someone who was had
never been Mormon, had been Christian, I guess.
But they heard about the Book of Abraham? That's
correct.
Pretty deep.
Yeah.
Well,
and I
for
think,
someone outside of
right,
the church.
but having grown up around Dallas, a lot of the churches would educate their own members about the anti-Mormon information that we personally didn't know. And based on that, I just Googled that one day, and then it was one thing led to another, and all this information started coming out, and just factual things.
Right.
Factual things.
You went down the rabbit hole.
Correct. And then I just got sucked in. I think I was up till 5 a.m.
Right. I know how that goes.
You just get sucked in, and it's just information. And then it was one thing after another, but
because
really,
you basically go back and forth. You find out information,
right.
then you try to figure out, is this true, is this not? And you keep searching, but then there's nothing really that really debunk whatever information you found, because it's factual, really.
Right.
And so you go down that rabbit hole, basically.
Correct.
That will keep you up for days and nights and weeks.
Yes. And
faith crisis.
Yes. And so I feel like I was in a full-blown faith crisis before I had even felt grasped a new foundation after being divorced.
Right.
So it's like, your identity's out the window from being a married Mormon woman. Now your whole identity of the church and what it means to be Mormon and your idea and understanding of God is now out the window.
That's
I truly can say that on a soul level, I felt like I was falling.
Oh, yeah.
And grasping for something.
Yeah.
And so it's at that point that I think, I sought counseling in earnest. The initial therapist that I had found that really understood where I was coming from and helped me understand and grasp potentially the issues that my ex-husband had been dealing with and what happened between us. I found someone to kind of move forward, and I literally sought her out saying, please help me understand and explore what's going on.
You're basically in a dark, deep hole at that point, and you need help.
And I was open and honest with this therapist and said, I am literally going through a crisis of faith. What I thought was real, I now have evidence is not. Help me start to lay a new foundation. And what does that look like? And so from the time that I was divorced to the time that I really felt I started to form this new foundation, and I made the decision to leave the church behind. It was a good 2 years. But it was 2 years of exploration. I would, being a designer at work, I don't have to read and write a lot. A lot of what I'm doing is kind of right-brained creative work where I'm drawing on the computer, putting things together. I'm actually able to listen to a lot of things. So I actually found John DeLynne's Mormon Stories and started listening to people's experiences, listening to the experiences of people that I was familiar with and their stories. I started connecting with people who had also left the church. I started connecting with some friends that I found out I knew at BYU who had come out. This was in 2012.
Okay.
I would connect with friends from BYU that I found out had left the church, or I found out were actually gay but weren't open about it at BYU, and they were now pursuing their true selves and their true identity. So I was connecting with these people, and I was wanting to connect with people's stories that didn't fit the mold, because I now no longer felt like I fit that mold.
Absolutely.
So I was looking to explore that. I was looking for belonging and understanding. I felt like I connected with a lot of the people that John was interviewing, because a lot of them felt a certain level of betrayal. I felt betrayed because I felt like there was a whole story that part of the history, correct, that they wrote out, and I felt that that's not fair. You should at least don't prevent people from knowing the full story and letting them choose from them by themselves. But so much of it is so damning.
Right. And now it's interesting because it's out there, right? Because once again, they've been pushed to put things out there for those who think that, it's revelation.
But they're controlling that narrative. They're controlling that narrative to benefit themselves.
They've put more out, with the stone and this and that. I mean, but how many years? I mean, shouldn't that have been out?
And it's not a problem.
Like,
and it's not a problem for people. And it's not a problem for people that they hid it from you for a reason.
Right. It's like, but it was always there. Well, where? Since we were not aware, and even if it was there, it wasn't obvious enough that so many people are shocked today.
Right.
And putting it out like a couple of years ago
Right.
is not soon enough.
Correct,
And it's
correct.
still deception,
Right.
and lying by omission.
Right. And so I feel like through this pursuit, I found this insatiable appetite for knowledge, on history, on what really happened that I wasn't aware of. Knowledge, just hearing other people's stories and being able to connect in one way or another with what they went through. I felt like a lot of the people that John interviewed had grew up in a similar situation with similar circumstances as myself. I had family members who suffered from mental illness, and there was never an explanation for, or the explanation was only spiritual, but it wasn't ever good enough.
Right.
And I still feel like I had some level of PTSD from some of those experiences that I had as a child.
Plus your divorce, which is really dramatic.
Right. Which there wasn't a spiritual explanation for those things that I went through, my family members with mental illness. There was not, the spiritual explanation wasn't good enough anymore.
Right.
So I was trying to explore what that meant, what that looked like, and how other people, dealt with that. So I would just be at work listening to these stories one right after another, and I would just be crying at my desk. Yeah. And I'm sure people thought I was crazy. They're like, what is she listening to, sitting here just with tears rolling down, and I was kind of doing my own thing, and I wasn't sobbing openly, but the tears were rolling down my face.
What you're talking about. I know exactly, because I think, anyone who's experienced a true faith crisis knows, even though we have different stories, but that, falling into that dark hole, your ground just breaking under your feet, having to rebuild, finding ways, trying to make sense of it all.
Right.
I think that is definitely a common experience that, probably millions have had, because even outside of the Mormon church, people have experiences like that. But it's a real thing, and it's very painful and hard. But I love to see how people come out of it too, because it's, you don't die from it. It's super painful, but you don't die from it. And there is a rebuilding and a reconstruction that is possible to do from there.
And I feel like critical to that, it's, then there's the question of, well, what do I believe, and how am I going to raise my children? Right. Because I still felt the need to find an answer for that. Absolutely. How am I going to lead them? And
where are my moral values?
Where are my moral values? Yes. Right. And I feel like that then allowed me the opportunity to explore all these different faith transitions and visit lots of different faith transitions to decide what feels good for me and what spiritual foundation I can help provide for my children.
What do you mean by visiting different faith transitions?
Traditions, different faith traditions. So, like visiting, the Buddhist faith tradition or different Christian faith traditions.
To try to figure out what feels right for me.
Correct. Just definitely exploring those. I continued to go to therapy where, because I was still also working on myself and potential relationships and how I can have healthy, safe relationships. Because I also feel like being in such a sheltered environment, being LDS, I wasn't prepared to date in the real world without kind of exploring healthy boundaries, because everyone that you could potentially date while you're Mormon is also kind of in that bubble. So the chances that you end up, with someone with nefarious motives, is potentially less, right? And it's just this whole other new world that is very dangerous for someone to jump into when you're
not familiar with it.
Not familiar with it, right?
Like,
and I think that was extremely crucial to start slowly, get out there as friends, and before you even start potentially dating. And when you do date friends of someone else, not just people that it's just so important. Right. I also, just started reading books. She would suggest books. A book that I read was called, Safe People. It kind of talked about, warning flags or people that may not be safe or healthy for you to be involved with. Another one that I found on my...
And that I would say is very important, because within the Mormon tradition, if you, really...
if you're Mormon, you're safe.
In a way. You just implicitly trust people. And that's why you hear all these, issues coming out now with the children being abused and this and that, or young women or young men being asked inappropriate questions in closed doors. I mean, and now they've changed some of these things.
Or even
finally,
young people,
because you implicitly trust. You trust
Correct.
the patriarchy, and you trust people just because they're the same faith.
Or even single people at BYU dating. Date rape happens. It happens with people who go to church.
I know.
And then the women feel like it's their fault, but they trusted that person and they didn't know what those boundaries should look like.
And also you have no experience, so you know
don't know when and how to get out of a situation and why. And so it's scary.
That's a topic that I also am going to bring in future episodes, because I personally know people who have gone through that.
What a very helpful book for me, it was called The Power of Now. And
is that Eckhart Tolle?
Yes, Eckhart Tolle. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his last name.
Eckhart Tolle or something. But yes,
crucial, because I was at a point in my life where I was mentally still connected to what had happened to me, because I felt like it wasn't my choice, right? I was put in a situation where I was divorced, but it wasn't my choice. Right? All these different things happened to me that I didn't choose, and I was still kind of mentally in victim mode, which is okay. You have to, I feel like that's something you have to go through and process. Absolutely. But his book really helped me get to the point where I realized I was giving power to what had happened to me, and not literally taking the power and the intention of now and moving forward. And it was such an incredible and automatic realization. I remember the one day that I got far enough in this book that I realized, oh my gosh, I am emotionally and energetically connected to what has happened to me and where I am today. And I cut those emotional and energetic ties. And it was such an overwhelming relief and weight lifted off my shoulders, where I felt like I'm not tied to that anymore. And it freed me up to be able to start literally laying a new foundation for myself.
And you can choose, you really take that power over the choices you're going to make, without letting, past or, present experiences dictate.
I felt it's like that a lot of that vulnerability that I think was attached to that victim mentality just dissolved. And I felt like I gained control back. And a lot of that energy I then just put into more research and more, I started dealing with those things that I had always had a problem with in the church in regards to, the polygamy I'd always had an issue with, or, blacks in the priesthood, that issue I've always had to deal with. And then I was able to start exploring, how, especially in 2014, 2015, how they were choosing to handle, the LGBTQ plus, individuals of the church, and the way that they were handling that. I felt free to be okay with feeling it wasn't okay.
To disagree. And that is a big, huge thing with anyone coming from a more, I don't know what's the right word to say, but very much controlled, I would say. Controlled.
Correct.
Because your way of thinking is pretty much... I don't like to use the word brainwash, but really scientifically, that's what it is. You've been taught to think a certain way. You've been taught to not disagree, and if you do, it's bad and wrong, and you really feel it on a deep level. And it's crazy now that I look back, because of course, I've been there. How giving yourself the permission to disagree, even when I remember when I did the interview with John Dellin, and he asked me, like, aren't you afraid that to contradict the leaders, and and I hadn't really deeply thought about it, but I said no, and it was the first time I think that I was truly giving myself permission, because it was public, to say, no, I do not feel bad about disagreeing with the leadership. I feel the way I do, and that's what I'm going to go with.
Because you're probably like me. I started making decisions based on my own conscience and trusting my own conscience.
Absolutely.
and my own moral basis, because I felt like, I trust how I feel more than what someone's telling me I should feel.
Absolutely.
And I was actually able to own all those icky feelings and issues I had with the church. I was able to own them for the first time and be okay with it. Right. Because I felt like at the end of the day, for people raised in the Mormon church or outside the Mormon church, at the end of the day, if we ever meet our maker and God, whatever form that is in, we're responsible for our own conscience and our own moral decisions. And it's like, I heard this, and I did not come up with this saying, but I truly, it resonated with me. But I heard someone say that their conscience pulled them out of the church kicking and screaming. Like they didn't swan dive into Babylon like people think when you leave the church, like, woo, I'm going to go sin. And you swan dive into Babylon, you're making that conscious decision. But no, I feel like for me, my conscience pulled me out kicking and screaming because it was against everything I had been brought up to believe, and everything I had been taught.
You
but
were
my
going
conscience
against that.
My conscience was telling me this isn't right.
And it's I think it's the same for me because quite frankly, I don't have all these, even though they are real and exist for, many people, I can't say that I had a bad experience. I can't say that I was mistreated. I can't say that as a Black woman, people were racist to me. I don't even have any of these stories. Quite frankly, it's all pretty positive. Like BYU is positive, my mission's positive, my friends is positive. Even my marriage, for the most part, aside from, if you take it in the context of the church, like I don't have any complaints. It was really finding out stuff that aren't true, and having to decide, am I going to go along, or because I could have chosen to do that. Some people do just to keep the peace in their homes, and I could have chosen to just go along, and
sometimes that's important too, and it's an individual.
Like, no, and the stuff that is not right, I can't just shut my mouth about that, and I can't just pretend it's not there, and I just can't. And
and for myself, I feel like being in a position where I was divorced, I was able to. I felt like making the decision to leave the church wasn't going to potentially break up a marriage, right? And I felt a lot more freedom to follow where my conscience was leading me at that time. And I realized not everyone has that. And it's such
it's huge. It's hard.
Yeah. But it's such a personal decision, and it can be so sticky. I feel, I feel blessed to be in a position where I was free to make that decision without greatly negatively affecting, my personal relationships.
And I must say that I had that luxury too, given my ex-husband left, years before I did, and I was in the same situation where it was, I had that hardship of mixed-faith relationship, but ultimately when I left, and I was still married at the time, I also had the luxury that it wasn't going to affect him or the children so much, or people around me.
Ultimately, the beauty of the position where I've been since I ended up resigning my membership from the church in November of 2014, and it was around the time that that the church's stance, on how. On the LGBTQ plus individuals in the church, and what they were going to allow their children to do or not do. It was around that time period, leading up to that. But I felt really good about resigning my membership at that point. I felt really good about myself and just continued to really build this new foundation. And the beauty of it all is, one of the things I've gotten into is just kind of, again, I haven't lost that insatiable appetite to just uncover things that have been hidden. Yeah. Because now I've thought, okay, what else that I've been taught in life is not a potential true story? What else is hidden? What else is a manicured storyline for control? And so it's like, it's a hobby.
That it doesn't belong just to the church. I mean, history anywhere can be.
It's like our history books are carefully written and sculpted with certain points of view. view. And so
Right.
I'm really fascinated by exploring different points of view
Right.
and potentially things that have been covered up and hidden,
Right.
and it won't go away. And people ask me where it comes from, and I don't know, but maybe it has to do with
that just
feeling
thirst.
controlled for
Yes.
so long, and then saying, no, I'm going to find knowledge on any side, and I'm going to listen to both sides, and no one can tell me not to. Yeah, we can take it upon ourselves to explore and look into, and there's just such beauty there. And accepting the fact that the reality that we've been given and the stories that we've been told and the knowledge that we have has been carefully sculpted.
Yes.
But when we can take the opportunity
By those who have power.
Correct.
Really.
It's carefully sculpted by those who have power, and it's like, you have to follow the money, and you have to learn and understand the intentions of those people, and then you start to see things in a different way. But then you're actually able to go out there, gain more knowledge. You can start seeing things in a different way and see things for what they really are. So, along with that, I have this huge desire to travel more and experience more culture. And I feel like the more people you get to know and understand, and the more time you spend in different cultures, you just gain a different perspective, and you love people on a different level, and you're less prejudiced per se.
And basically afraid of what's different than you.
Correct.
It boils down to that, being afraid of what's different than you.
I feel like the kind of the cultural elite, or the people in power and control, want to keep us divided here, because you can control what's divided.
Absolutely.
And they keep creating these situations and pushing them to literally bipolar extremes. And I think at a core level, culturally, that's not where we need to be. And we need to stop trying to polarize us. And we need to see that for what it is and why it's happening. I've been able to, and I don't like that. I don't like that feeling.
It serves those in power. It
Correct.
really does. But I like the push against it, especially I think from the younger generation, which I hope will become louder and louder, because they are used to mixity. They're used to having different people around. They're used to having LGBTQ around, and it's a normal thing.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
amazing.
I love,
and they're accepting of people for who they are, and they're being brought up to love them. And I feel like even if the next generation can just get to the point where they can say, maybe I don't know everything, and maybe the tradition that I was brought up in, that helps me justify judging other people and other people's decisions. Maybe it's not 100% correct. Maybe I need to find and justify reasons to accept and love people.
Is my moral ground with my kids now. Being good for goodness sake, work on bettering yourself, and if you'd ask me, what do I teach my kids? I'm like, just be good, like treat others kindly, and question everything. Do not accept everything for face value. And I like that they're really internalizing that, like, because they make their own decision, whether it's family members asking them to go to church or go see this or that. Like, I don't even tell them you need to do this or that. My daughter was like, Mom, I want to be Catholic. I'm like, sure. You need to show me. Study for like 3 months every day. Tell me. I'm gonna question and ask if you are able to show me that you know what it's about, and then you still want to join. Fine, go ahead, do it. But I want you to do the work and understand what it is you're gonna join, or what I mean. Like, show me that you understand first, because of course it was her friends are going to catechism or whatever, and she wanted to hop in. I wanted them to learn. I want them to know what's in the Bible. I want them to know what's in the Quran and in the Torah, because it's knowledge.
It is knowledge. And I feel like we're allowing our children the opportunity to make certain decisions for themselves based on their own conscience much early. We're not telling them what to do because someone else, a prophet, has told us to. They're exploring both sides, and they're learning to be.
Because the prophet said so.
Correct.
It's just like a parent, because I said so.
Correct. But how much more powerful is it when you teach your child to look at both sides and make a moral decision, for themselves? Because if you make a moral decision for yourself, instead of, oh, here's one side, now you need to make that moral decision because we've already decided for you. It's explore both sides of the coin. In conclusion, I could say that I've been able to find a lot of peace through the knowledge that I've been able to gain and through these different faith traditions that I've been able to explore. For example, meditation or secular Buddhism, I've found a lot of value in that, being able to, even spiritual value that I don't even necessarily feel is tied to worshiping anything. Right. I feel that, in a way, God or our creator or source is love, and there's power behind love and intention. Absolutely. And, and even when you start to explore the science and the data that supports the power of love and intention and meditation and even prayer, it's just, I realize in a way, it validates the things that I still feel strongly about that I learned in the Mormon church. Right. It validates those times that I felt God. Right. And I felt God testify to me of truth. It validates that. It doesn't invalidate that. It validates that. But it validates such a bigger story. It validates the love and the intention everywhere in different religions everywhere. And that for me has become the bigger picture and the bigger story. And, it's led me to an understanding of a collective consciousness that through this collective consciousness, if we're actually able to realize that that is real and that there's so much power behind that love and intention, that we literally have the power to change the world. Absolutely. And that's just, it's so beautiful. And I'm so happy and excited to teach my children about that. Absolutely. And just that the important thing is connecting to that, in their consciences, and follow their conscience, their conscience and where that leads them. And I feel like, that will allow them to be in charge of their own decisions, and help them make better decisions in the long run. But again, I think as humanity, we can start pressing forward. The more people start questioning and seeking knowledge
owning their power of decision making, thinking, thought process. You have to own that.
Right. And some of the knowledge may be contradictory to what you were brought up to believe, but accept the fact that that could be the case. And because then really the doors are just open to limit this knowledge.
Be scary too. It's the only way, in my opinion, to true growth is to open these doors. And yes, it's scary at first when you were in your box, and then you have so much freedom because you've broken down the walls. Like I like to say, like for me, I just broke down all the walls around me, and not to say that I took all the good, like you were saying that I was given. I don't want to portray the Mormon church as being all bad or negative, because there is a lot of universal truth that, quite frankly, you can find everywhere else except for the Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, like the fundamental truth that you find in any Christianism, Buddhism, Hinduism. I mean, and you said it. I mean, at the center is love. Not even, I would say, Jesus, because how many people on earth do not believe in him? Not to say he was good or bad or whatever, but really love is the core and that connectivity we have as human being. If we all tap into that should be enough. Yeah. That should be enough. Like there is no need for definition or thinking that you're certain of what's happening here. Or there's no need for that. And even when you say God, I mean, for my friend the atheist, which I have some really good friends, and they're atheists and they're good, great people, I would call it even just the power of connection and connectivity. Right. If you don't want to call it God, because of course we have to use language that we understand.
Let's say we share a human consciousness at some level,
and use the term that means something to you, and then I'm not saying that to you in particular, but when I was trying to stir away from the language that had been given to me, such as feeling the spirit, for this or that, I decided to just call it connection, feeling connected, whether more connected with myself, more connected with people around me, more connected to nature, the universe, feeling that connectivity,
that source, that love,
the source of and that the core is love. I do believe that, and if we all tap into that, it makes sense, because I also feel like we all come to that universal truth, a universal understanding that yes, it is love, and yes, it is feeling connected to each other, and because we're connected, we treat each other better, and we treat each other and what's around us better.
Right. We're not bound by those traditional boundaries that have, that have created all these different, all these different beliefs that we should be separate.
Right.
We should, where we're judging other people and judging those situations and judging other religions. So it's, I feel like humanity is almost at a point of potential evolution moving forward.
I feel the same way, and I think all people who kind of dig into this, focusing on the now, like you say, I think we all come to the same conclusion of those universal truths, and we need to hold on to that and tap into that, and it's beautiful. And yeah, as far as like teaching my kids, I want them to, like you, I want them to tap into that. Just have love in your heart, and when you really focus on that, it spills out in so many different ways for nature and the creatures around you, and you want to respect yourself and others, and and we touched on that, digging inside, and that touches to the mental health discussion we had, that we have to have that courage to look inside and deal with what's hard, so we can be connected to ourselves, because the more we run away from these things, these issues we have inside, we also become disconnected to ourselves, because all we do is putting band-aids on all these things, and it's passing under, and we're not looking at it, and we go through life with all these aches that we don't address. So, well, thank you so much for coming today. This was really a beautiful discussion. Thank you for opening up and telling such personal stories that have opened my eyes on many things. And I'm sure will help many people going through one thing or another, or I know it will be helpful. So thank you so much for coming today. I really,
my pleasure.
Really
thank you for
that.
inviting me.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember that life has amazing things in store for you if you don't give up. I'm Juliana. This is the Faith Transition Podcast. I will see you next time.